So basically, we're gonna talk about consciousness. So before I delve too much into this, let me just preface that we've been talking about consciousness and various aspects of it for the last several discussions. And again, a lot of the people here, and I in particular, also are very much interested in this topic. Actually, let me stop the share just for a second, so we can just have a face-to-face a little bit. So I think consciousness is one of those topics that most people are very much interested, that we're acutely aware of limitations and challenges in understanding it. And over now it's been almost actually it's been more than 2 years that we've been doing this as part of this group. So I think we've delved into many areas. In the beginning, what I tried to do is I tried to have discussions and explanations for the more mundane, the more simpler areas of how a brain works, how a mind or a neuronal circuit works for simpler organisms. And I think a lot of the people who've been involved in this for at least a year have a pretty good understanding of a lot of that. So we don't tend to go into the simpler things anymore. Although if somebody has a question, we can discuss it, but though I won't necessarily pull up the slides. I've had a lot of presentations that have gone into explaining many aspects of brain function, reasons why in the neuroscientific community why things are believed to be the way they are, and it's not out of hypotheses. There are a lot of studies that have been done for now going on close to 80 years. I mean, these are really very sound and very solid studies that have been replicated in many different scenarios, many situations, and the data collected is pretty strong. So a lot of what's understood in terms of brain, mind, and any kind of neuronal circuit is at least in the normal processing of what an organism does. It's well understood. But when we get into the higher order behaviors, for example, consciousness, those are areas that are still being researched. There are a lot of theories around it, and so those are the areas that we've been going into in the last few months. I mean, I covered it early on also, but I covered it very superficially early on, just as an introduction. But we've been delving slowly into more and more aspects. So last time we went into with consciousness, and hopefully most people tonight will recognize or remember that when we talk about consciousness, what we're saying is that consciousness is really it consists of one or more regions, and most neuroscientists think there are multiple regions, but basically it's a subset of the entire brain. And again, when we talk about consciousness, we've talked about many different levels of consciousness. Consciousness exists in simpler animals and organisms. They exist in other primates. They exist in humans, obviously, and they exist in many different ways. When we talk about consciousness, most of us assume that we're referring to human-like consciousness, but consciousness, the word, actually has many meanings. It has many concepts around it. And in neuroscience, because it's so difficult to talk about these broad sets of constructs that this word refers to, it makes it much more difficult, especially when we're talking with non-scientists, to use the term consciousness. So I tried to lay out some of the basic foundations last time and the past few times to kind of give a hierarchy of the types of activities that happen in a brain, the different types of consciousness that can happen, not just in humans, but in simpler animals also. So given that background, given those understandings, it's important to recognize that when we use the word consciousness, we're not necessarily talking about the highest levels of behavior. So, but tonight we are going to go into some of actually we're going to span behaviors in consciousness, starting with at the lower levels. So for example, many of the simpler animals, their levels of consciousness, how they promote survival, and then we'll slowly delve into behaviors in humans and other primates where consciousness helps us. Now, the theme tonight is around survival because consciousness is a critical aspect of survival. So let me start the slide in this context. So we'll start with that first, just to set a groundwork for what that means and exactly what. So starting with consciousness. So consciousness helps survival. Very simple statement, but it actually has very profound and very broad implications. So a brain, which in its simplest form, it's basically a neuronal circuitry. It's a circuit. It's a set of interconnected neurons. And so in the higher mammals, or mammals for that matter, brains are more complex. But in simpler organisms, such as insects and even worms, even very, very extremely simple organisms, multicellular organisms, we can think of them having a brain, although it doesn't appear to be the type of brain that are in the more complex organisms. They're basically many, many fewer neurons, and the brain doesn't have regions the way we think of it. They're very simple and they operate at a very, very simple level. So neuronal circuitry is really the right way to describe the central nervous system, especially the brain within the central nervous system. But tonight we're going to talk about many, many different types of organisms, from the simplest to the most complex. So the word brain, in quotes, is appropriate. So the brain really evolved for a few different reasons. One, it evolved for short-term survival. And this is a theme we've discussed many, many times. Probably in every talk that I've given, I've raised this idea that the brain is one of the principal organs that evolved for the purposes of survival. And we've delved into some of these in the past, and I'm going to repeat some of that, but I'm going to delve into some of the higher order behaviors of why the brain is so important, and the higher order behaviors, especially around consciousness. We're going to delve into those. Those we haven't talked about much. On the periphery we have, but not really diving into those. So short-term survival has been important for the brain. It's one of the critical organs that helps us to survive. And one way to think of this is that if an organism does not have a brain, it does not have any neuronal circuitry. If you think of and you can think of it in another sense, that let's say you have a primate, let's say you have an orangutan, and it's born with severe abnormality where it does not have a brain. It literally does not have a brain. It has everything else in its body, but it's lacking a brain. So that type of organism, it will be able to survive short term for about a week, okay, or less if for smaller organisms, smaller life forms, its survival will be less. But basically, it's limited, a short-term survival. And what happens without the brain is that each of the organs are basically doing things to distribute energy, because the organism needs energy to survive. It has to metabolize. It has to each cell in the body has to get energy from somewhere to basically live, to keep staying alive. And all of the cells, assuming it's a multicellular organism, it has to be if it's complex. So all of these cells have to kind of work together to keep that organism alive. So it may have a cardiovascular system, or a very primitive one. It may not even have veins and arteries. It may just have fluid that kind of gush inside of its cavities, where it doesn't have a distinct cardiovascular system, but it has some type of transport mechanism. So that organism will be able to transport, let's say, oxygen. It may use that for managing waste, for example, carbon dioxide or cellular byproducts. It may even use it for heat management, because our blood, these are the things that our blood does. Our blood distributes oxygen throughout our body. It removes carbon dioxide from all of the cellular tissue and moves it back into our lungs where we exhale it. Waste management, it handles a lot of that. Heat management, or regulating our temperature to a limited extent. There's much more that's done in other ways. So all of these things together are done Some of these things are done without a brain, but when the organism has a brain, these things are done in much more complex ways. So the more advanced organisms really need a brain to do a lot of these things. The first four bullets on here are very difficult to do without some type of neuronal circuitry, although it can be done. And for the simplest organisms, they do it without a brain, or they do it with an extremely simple brain. But as you get larger, as organism gets larger, and the environment lives in, and the situations it has to live in get more complicated, that brain becomes more important, and the brain has to be more sophisticated. So the last bullet here, the extent of short-term survival with or without a brain really depends on the environment in which it's existing. So for example, given, I described this orangutan which is born without a brain. So if in the environment it has another animal, another parent, let's say, that kind of feeds it and nurtures it and takes care of it, it's providing for it, then that organism will probably be able to live even though it doesn't have literally a brain, because it's being given, and that parent orangutan it will be difficult, but it'll have to figure out, and it'll have to feed it, it'll have to do whatever is necessary to keep it alive. So the environment basically is what drives the survival of the organism. And if it does have a brain, then again, that brain will, the abilities of the brain and the extent to which that brain can help it survive for short term depends on the nexus between the capabilities of that brain and the sophistication of the environment. For example, if the environment, if the organism is living in an environment where food is floating kind of all around you, and all you have to do is inhale, and the food kind of goes into your mouth, that's a very comfortable environment. You really don't have to search for food. And that happens for us with oxygen. We don't have to go search for oxygen. We just inhale and the oxygen goes into us. So in a similar sense, if you had an environment where you just inhaled and the food went into you, similar to what whales have. Whales live in an environment where they basically literally breathe in water, and they have a mechanism inside their mouth which kind of filters through the krill and all kinds of microscopic organisms, and that nourishes them, that provides food for them. They don't have to literally hunt, although they do hunt larger organisms, but many whale species survive simply by passing water through their mouth, and they get a lot of nourishment from that. So if the environment allows you to do that without actively hunting or finding or foraging food, if the environment is really that comfortable, then that brain doesn't have to do much, and it doesn't have to be a sophisticated brain. But let me just take a step back. So, and the consequence is that if you are in that type of environment, what will basically happen is that the capacity of that environment to keep you and your species, assuming you're not going to be a single organism, you're going to procreate, you're going to multiply, and you'll have other organisms similar to you, and there may be other species around you that are different from you. So all of the organisms around you in that environment will be competing to some extent, and they may be cooperating also depending on the extent and the type of situation. So there's a lot of complexity in this environment, this simple environment that we're talking about. But that environment will have a maximum threshold that it can sustain your species as well as all of the other species. And assuming the other species don't compete with you and you don't compete with them, assuming that, or there's no predatory behavior between species, all species are simply living on their own and they're not really attacking other species. In that sense, it's simple. Again, the environment is simple. But even then, that environment will have a maximum capacity for which it can sustain a number of life forms. And once you reach that maximum, then the population, the number of your organism that can survive at any given time will fluctuate over time. It'll have a population yo-yo effect. It'll oscillate basically. And depending on the complexity of other species, that oscillation will be much more chaotic and difficult to predict. But basically, there will be a maximum saturation that environment will sustain. And you can't go beyond that. And that's the limit of that environment. Now, in the real world, organisms want to survive more than that. So once, the evolution gave us a brain or evolved a brain, What happened is that gave, it imposed many different types of additional behaviors into these organisms. For example, competition. It could not only compete with its own species, within its own species, but it could compete with other species. It could attack or defend from other species. So the brain allowed these types of behaviors also. And again, this is a slightly more sophisticated brain we're talking about. The brain, basically what it did is it tried to create a niche within that environment so that you could maximize and go beyond the capacity of that environment, because the environment has a limited capacity to sustain a certain number of life forms. And if you as a life form, or your species as a life form, wants to maximize its existence, you have to manipulate the environment to your benefit. And that's what the brain, the primitive brain, the early brain, allowed organisms to do. It allowed us to manipulate our environment, and including the other organisms around us. For example, many, in the ocean, a lot of life, life is believed to have started in the deep oceans, primordial oceans. And a lot of the precursor organisms basically began to eat each other. And that's a simple way to maximize your survival without relying on the environment. Because the environment, if it can't provide nourishment and protection, then you have to do it a little bit yourself. And so these early brains allowed organisms to start to seek out, to look for other organisms that they could eat. So for long-term survival, these early brains created the ability to assess and understand what else is around you, to know the environment around you. And the key idea here is that survivability was raised beyond the critical capacity of that environment to sustain life. The environment has a theoretical limit of the number of life forms it can sustain, but sophisticated brains allowed organisms to live and surpass that limitation that the environment of the natural world has. So the brain allowed more organisms to survive within a certain environment. So in spite of the environment, the brain allowed organisms to overcome and to survive and thrive in these environments. And again, this is because it gave us the ability to assess and understand. And again, assessment happened through our simple senses. All organisms have a very simple sensory input, which they take in information about the environment. They try to understand based on that. And the understanding in primitive organisms is pretty simple. The understanding may be biochemical understanding in terms of signals. It may be light, for example, in a primordial ocean, there's not a lot of light. So you can have a biofluorescent organism. So if you see biofluorescence from another organism, through evolution, your brain has been trained to recognize that biofluorescent thing out there might be food. Or if it's of a certain color, you might be trained to recognize it as a threat. So you'll stay away from it, or you'll move away from it. So depending on how evolution trained your brain, you'll either move toward it to eat it, or you'll move away from it and evade it to protect yourself. So these things were kind of built into a lot of the primitive brains. And those aspects still remain within our brain, although they're very primitive. But even humans today have many of the same aspects in our visual system and most of our sensory systems with aspects like that. Though our behavior is much more complex, these primitive behaviors are usually not prominent in us, but they are there in our genetics and at the coarse level, the deepest levels of our brain. Also, planning is something that these brains allowed to happen. And planning is a very sophisticated thing. So it wasn't happening in the simplest organisms, but as you went into the simpler mammals, rats and rodents, for example, they could plan. They could, once they recognized that, they got a lay of the land of their environment where they lived, where they grew up. They knew that in that, a quarter of a mile in that direction, there's lots of food. And in another direction, there's something else. So they kind of built a memory. And then so when they start to get hungry, they remember that in that direction, there's food, and they'll tend to go in that direction looking for the food that they had found earlier. And as the environment changes and evolves, they'll change their map of the environment to help their survival. So this is a simple type of planning. For us humans, it's much more complicated. We rarely have to do much planning but the fact is, for survival, most of us don't really have to plan much in terms of where we're going to get our food, but the act of going shopping is an act of planning. We have to make time in our busy schedules to go shopping, to purchase food. We have to have a refrigerator in our house. We have to, put the food into the refrigerator and so on and so forth. So these are more sophisticated versions of planning, but it's still planning for the most simplest level of survival, for example, food. So planning happens in all organisms, but in the more complex organisms, this planning actually happens over longer periods of time. And planning is one of those things where it's inherent with time. And we're not going to go into this tonight, but some of the higher order behaviors in organisms, for example, time is recognized by even simpler organisms. Most dogs and cats, there have been studies done, rodents, there have been studies done where it's recognized that they have a very different, it's not like a human understanding of time, but they do have an understanding of time. And the brain has to have a conceptualization of time, not the way we do, not in terms of a calendar, but they have to have a conceptualization of a future and a past, or a future and the present at least. You have to have a demarcation of the present and future, and a lot of animals do, simpler mammals do have that. So that's something I'm just going to put out there, but we humans obviously have much more of that. And the third, at the beginning here, mastery of the environment. So when we're talking about the most complicated behaviors and the most sophisticated brain, what happens is that these sophisticated brains allow organisms to basically master not only the environment that they live in, but any environment that they may find themselves in. So, for example, if you look at human civilization, right, we evolved in Africa. We moved out of Africa into Europe and Asia. We went more and more eastward throughout Asia into Baltic and Russian northeastern regions of Russia. We went across the Aleutian Islands, the Baltic region. We entered North America. We went down into North America throughout Central South America. We may have migrated in other ways, not to say that's the only path, but basically we went throughout the planet. We kept moving, and we were able to do that even though we were finding environments which were extremely inhospitable. Areas like Siberia, or areas like deserts in the Middle East are extremely inhospitable, yet humans survived in all of these areas. Whereas we don't find many animals in those areas. You really don't, the extent of a lot of animals and where they survive are not as, the breadth is not as much as the extent to which humans have been able to survive. So humans can survive in pretty much any environment on this planet, other than the deep ocean, although we can survive in the deep ocean, but because it's not easy to get food down there, we theoretically can. We have submersible vehicles, and if we could keep bringing food down, we would be able to survive underwater for years if we needed to. So theoretically, we can survive anywhere on the planet for as long as we need, because we have mastered not only the environments in which we exist, but we've mastered the ability to manipulate the environments in which we exist, to go into any environment and to bring all of the resources that we need, food, energy, shelter, companionship, anything and everything that we need, we can move and bring into any environment and basically live. So if you look at the Inuits, they live for 10,000 years, more than 10,000 years. They've lived in the most remote, most barren, most frigid areas of the planet, but they've been able to survive for 10,000 years because they've been able to master building shelter, finding food from large mammals and large sea life in the oceans, many different ways. So mastery of the environment is one of the higher order behaviors that came about with a sophisticated brain, and we humans especially show that. So the key concept here is the information that flows in throughout the brain, throughout the neuronal circuitry. That's a key idea we have to recognize. We've talked about this in the past, but this is the key idea that the information that flows, again, through our senses, also information that we store within our brain through memory and through our past experiences. And a lot of these information gets stored not just actively, we're not trying to remember, but they the habits that we form through repetitive actions and repetitive experiences. For example, if you always go out onto the ocean as an Inuit child and you see your parents or your fathers or the male in your tribe are engaged in hunting activities, you learn about the hunting activities. You're not actually doing it as a child, but you're watching and you're observing it, and your brain is learning about it. And so as you become an adolescent and as you become a young adult, a lot of that learned memory comes back, and then it can be used by you to actually engage in early hunting, with other adults to guide you, and you become a good hunter at that point. So a lot of the memory that we absorb is also part of the information. It's not just that we only gather information in real time from the external. We also have information that we store passively or actively, which helps us to understand and manipulate the world around us. So information is a key. And then the thinking part of it is where we're manipulating the information in sophisticated ways. We're processing it in unique ways. And so all of these things have to do with neuronal circuitry. The simplest organisms do it, and the most complex organisms also do it. So these are aspects that are central to every type of life form that has any kind of a brain, simple or complex brain. So let's go a little further into this. So consciousness. So there's an idea here that let me present. So consciousness gives us a sense of reality, okay? And we've talked about what that really means, and we've talked about that the sense of reality that we have is not really a full picture of reality. That the reality that we have is created. Our brain creates reality for us. There is no such thing as reality, so just in a simple way, reality is everything that's outside of our body, okay? In one sense, you can include your own body. Our own body is part of reality. It is really a part of reality. But usually when we talk about reality, we talk about external, but our internal state of our body, the internal state of our mind, and us, our body, in the physical world, that we're also part of reality. But when we're talking about for survival purposes, we're usually dealing with external reality that's separate from our body. Although there's a part where I'm going to go, I'm not sure how much I'm going to go into it tonight, but for example, if your body gets injured, okay, if you're an animal living in the world, surviving in this world, you're going to come into situations where you're under threat, and you may be either chased or you may be chasing another animal, and in that altercation, you may get injured. And if you're injured, then the state of your body, the condition of your body, the amount of pain that you feel, this is information that's very important to your brain. Your brain needs to know that, and your brain needs to process it, and your brain needs to, if you're injured in a severe way, your brain needs to know that you're injured severely, and therefore it has to change its behavior to kind of get you outside of a dangerous situation. You may have to go into a very different location to protect yourself and to allow yourself to heal. And organisms are able to do this because they have the ability to understand their existence in reality, the fact that they're injured in reality. Reality again is complex, but for this slide, we're going to talk primarily about reality being outside of us. But when you get into the depth of a lot of these things, there's so many different contexts that information exists within, or an organism can exist within. So I'm going to, kind of constrain this for this slide at least. So the information that we need to process that comes from the external world, from this external reality, is really there's too much. There's too much information out there in the physical world. Okay, and most brains cannot. I should probably speculate to say that no brain can handle all of the information that is out there at any given moment. And that's one of the reasons why, and that's the simplest way to look at this idea that the brain creates reality. At the simplest level, what that means is the brain picks and chooses from all of the information out there. It picks and chooses. It selectively only takes some of the information that's out there and puts it inside of our brain, or makes sense of it, to give us an understanding of what really is happening, where we are, and all of that. So this idea is very important, that the brain intentionally, and what I mean by intentional is not that the brain is thinking about it. It's not an active process where the brain selectively chooses what to do. This is a lot of this happened evolutionarily, whereby as we developed from the simplest organisms, for example, our visual system. Okay, our visual system developed over basically 400 million years. And the modern visual system of most modern mammals are extremely sophisticated, and they are relatively high resolution, and they have color vision or multicolor, multispectral imaging, multispectral vision, which means that there's a lot of information. Now, the fact that we're able to see multiple colors is itself a type of limitation, because the information in the real world exists more than just in terms of the three colors that the human eye can see. The human eye, or some eyes can actually see 3.5 colors. So even though we can see 3.5 colors, in reality, in the universe, there are many other colors that we cannot see. And this is true of any organism. So just by that nature, because of the limitation of our eye, our brain developed to not recognize many colors, because our eye can't even pick up the signal from that. For example, infrared or ultraviolet, those are actual colors that we cannot sense. Or we might sense on the periphery. Some of us can sense on the periphery of ultraviolet. When they see blue and purple, they can actually, very, very few people can actually have a sense of a little more information in the ultraviolet. It's rare, but they do. But even then, most of that ultraviolet no human can see. So we are limited in that sense. Many animals, dogs, it's believed there are certain colors that they can't see. It's not that they see in black and white. They do see color, but the color spectrum that a dog's eye and a brain recognizes is very different from what a human brain recognizes. So limitation is built into the amount of information that our brain collects and processes is built into us through evolution. It's limited by evolution. And also it's limited because our brain has a limited capacity to process information. If our brain had to deal with all of the information in front of us, it would be overloaded. It literally would be overloaded. It would not be able to do a lot of things. So in a sense, this is why our visual system, for those of you who understand our visual system, most of our vision is very blurry. But in a central part of our vision, we have extremely acute, very high resolution imaging, but most of our vision is very blurry. Our peripheral vision, we see very, very hazily. And that's another example, because what our brain is doing is it's collecting, it appears to us that everything is high resolution, but our brain creates that false sense based on what it's capturing using this sophisticated eye that we've evolved. So again, the reality that we have is created, and it really depends on how the evolutionary path that we went through, the environments that we lived in. So humans have lived in many, many different types of environments. This is one of the reasons why our brain has evolved in more sophisticated ways, because it's had to live in, and not to say that every human, but those descendants whose ancestors lived in, for example, the tundra, their eye had to deal with the vast amounts of reflection that comes off of that blinds you when you're living in an icy tundra, because the sunlight reflecting off of the white snow or ice can be blinding, and it can actually damage your eyes. So their visual system, their brain has evolved in slightly different ways. So if your ancestry has that aspect to it, your vision is slightly different based on that. And today people, come from anywhere and everywhere. So you really have to know where your ancestors came from to know that aspect of your genetics. But the fact is that all of us have many, many different changes and differences amongst each other based on where and how the environments that our ancestors lived. So the information that we're getting and the reality that our brain creates using that subset of information is a simplified reality. So what that means is that the brain literally ignores much of the information, and it's not so much that it actively ignores; it just kind of doesn't even take it in. It just doesn't even let the information come in. Okay. Also, what that means is that the brain prioritizes certain information over other information. And again, this is a complex idea. I've talked about some of it in past, but there's many different levels to what this one bullet means, that it prioritizes information. We're not going to go into depth here, but it's the simplest sense. We are, for example, our body recognizes the temperature of the air in which we're sitting right now. Our brain recognizes roughly the temperature of the air in which we're sitting right now, but our conscious brain is not aware of it. Or I should say, most of your brains were not aware of it until I brought that up. When I brought up the idea of the temperature of the air, then your mind might have become aware of that information. But that information is inside your brain because your body needs that information to know whether it should be shivering or not. Because if it's literally cold and freezing out where you're sitting, then your body needs to shiver, or your body needs to do something. It might need to move to a warmer location. So your body needs to know the temperature. Your body always is collecting that information, but our conscious mind rarely is aware of it because, again, our brain is prioritizing that, and it kind of deprioritizes that aspect. That aspect goes into the lower forms of our brain, not into our consciousness, which is the higher area. It goes into and stays within the lower areas of our brain where it's necessary for thermal regulation of our body and other aspects. But it doesn't need to be in our consciousness. So again, priority of information is very important. Also, now this is a very important idea, but it's very difficult to explain thoroughly. We're going to delve a little more into it tonight, but I may have to go into it further. Our brain literally changes the information that we sense. Okay, it simplifies the world for us, and I've got a few simple examples. And so when we think of optical illusions or even audio illusion, any kind of illusions have to do with our perceptual system. And again, when we're talking about information, we're talking about information that we get from the outside through our sensory system. So our sensory systems have flaws baked into them through evolution. And we don't have to think of them as flaws, but they're basically a reaction to the overload of information. In a sense, it's a way of managing the too much information that the world has. And so it kind of picks and chooses information. And when it does that, the limited amounts of information it chooses sometimes in some situations fools us. Or our sensory, for example, our eye, when we only collect certain information, I'm using the example, I'm going to point this out. I have an example coming up, two examples coming up where I think this will help explain what I mean by this. But it's believed, there have been a lot of studies, and it's believed that every human brain, and probably many mammalian brains also, when we look at reality, what we recognize as reality is actually shifted in time backwards. So as reality is happening in front of us, we're not aware of it instantly. We become aware of it with a slight delayed reaction. And depending on the type of input, it's as little as 100 milliseconds, and it can be more delayed than that. So 100 milliseconds is not a whole lot, but it's enough. And one of the examples that I have will show you, and this is with you, it's very difficult to undo it. I mean, you can train yourself to kind of not have that effect, but the normal behavior of our brain is to do this, and it's a simplification process. And that delay is one aspect of it has to do with the prioritization of information, and the other aspect has to do with the changing reality. In many studies and many research research findings, what we found is that when something happens inside the brain, our conceptual realization of it, our conscious realization of it, is delayed. Okay? That doesn't mean that information is delayed everywhere in our brain, but especially in particular with our conscious realization, it's almost always delayed. And that's the part we're talking about consciousness tonight. So that's why I want to focus that this warping of reality is very specific to consciousness, okay, not to every aspect of our brain. Many parts of our brain, especially the subconscious, it isn't warped, or it has a true picture of what's happening in the world, or a truer picture as much as our brain can get. Again, it ignores much of the information. So since it's ignoring, it won't have all the information, but of the information it collects, the lower areas of our brain do capture information in more real time and more accurately. For example, our sense of temperature, that's pretty accurate. Our sense of pain, those are things that are important for our body for survival, acutely important. So our brain doesn't do a lot of distortion or warping of that information. But again, that information, when it goes into our conscious mind, can be warped. For example, if you get a finger cut, most of us have experienced this, where you get a finger cut, we're not aware of it, and we don't feel any pain. But after we see that our finger has a little bit of blood on it, and we realize that our finger is cut, then we start to feel a little bit of pain. Then we realize, and then we actually feel the sensation of that finger cut. And this is an example, a simple example of reality. Our body literally was cut. There was damage, physical damage to cells and even nerves. You know, a lot of times when you get cut, some nerves can be cut. That's part of the reason why it feels painful, and why that pain persists for days, you know, until your body heals. So your mind literally ignores it because it can. It's very easy to ignore information like physical damage to the brain. So anyway, here's the first example. So in this, let me do this. I'm going to ask everybody. There's a dot, stationary dot on the left side. Using both eyes, keep staring at that dot. Okay, and with your peripheral vision, I want you to basically consider, right? Think about, don't look at, but consider what's happening with that other moving part of the image. Keep looking at the stationary dot. Okay, hopefully the video is fast enough that everybody can keep up with this, right? Think about what's happening. All right. So I'm going to let this happen for a little more. Hopefully, if anybody can't see it, you know, I'm going to stop the animation a little bit, and then we're going to pause, and we'll talk about this just for a minute or two. So hopefully everybody has had a chance to understand. So keep looking, keep staring basically at that stationary dot on the left side, and think about what your perception is of the moving object on the other side, on the right side. All right, so let me stop the animation now. Okay, and we'll stop here. We'll also do some Q&A, you know, after this. But I want to basically talk about that just a little initially. So, Joe, we can let people unmute themselves if they want, or they can raise their hand in the chat. They can put an exclamation mark. So, anybody want to give an idea of what they experienced, what they thought was happening on the right side of that image? Again, only comment if you were able to keep staring at the left side. If you looked at the right side, then you know you're not going to be able to understand what this is about. So if you were able to focus only on the left side and using your peripheral vision, you saw something happen on the right side. You know, I'm looking for people to describe what was happening.
So DLJ, then Vanessa.
Yeah, so the dancing shadowy bit did seem to disappear as it moved down left. As it moved down left, there was a moment, a flash when it sort of disappeared, and then when it moved back again, then it reappeared. That's what I got. So
how would you describe its motion, or what you felt was its motion?
Oh, I see. So it's okay. So you essentially had it's because of the shadow, or the perceived shadow, the black-white part. It seemed to be like a raised, sort of embossed, or versus indented. But that was all fairly random, and then occasionally it seemed to get less random, and then it moved bottom left, and bottom left it disappeared.
Okay, so it was moving diagonally, or in a straight line, or vertically, or horizontally. What do you think?
Oh, actually, it struck me as fairly random with occasional diagonals, and when it moved diagonal, that's the bit when it disappeared. Yeah.
Okay. So some of that may have been the video artifact, because if it disappeared, it shouldn't be disappearing, but that may be the video. But basically, it appeared to be diagonal at times, and it disappeared at other times for you.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? Vanessa?
Yeah, I noticed it seemed to switch orientation. At one point, the black side would go from left to right, kind of like a butterfly flapping its wings. and it did kind of follow a like clumsy, almost like an elliptical orbit. It did look like there was some rhyme or reason. It wasn't static, but it didn't really seem to either reverse direction. It didn't suddenly go, down, then decide to, oh, I'm gonna, pop over here like randomly. So there was some sort of sequence and consistency to it.
Okay.
Julie would like to comment.
Okay, Julie?
To me, it looked like you were randomly moving a mouse around in circles randomly.
Okay, so it was moving in multiple directions for you. Is that right?
Pretty circular, kind of.
Circular? Okay, okay. All right. Anyone else?
I mean, I'll just comment just really quickly. I felt that it started to develop a pattern
Okay.
over as the time went on, especially if when it went to the bottom of the page, kind of made a curvature. I felt like kind of almost half a circle type of movement,
Okay.
like a
okay.
180 over and over.
180 in what direction do you think? Or what types of directions was it?
It was like it was going to the left. I mean, so it was like almost like a curve, like a half a circle, like essentially.
Okay. All right. So let me.
I mean, that's the eventual pattern. The first pattern that seemed
right.
a little bit more random.
Okay. So let me do this. So I'm going to go into explaining what we saw, but let me put up a second. It'll look very similar, but it's different. And again, I want people to do the same thing. Look at the stationary black dot on the left side. I'm assuming that the dot is on the left side. I'm not sure how the video is zoomed. Sometimes reverses the image sometimes, but anyway, here's a second slide I'm going to start. And hopefully everybody's able to see it. So so again, look at the stationary dot on the left and try to follow what's happening with your peripheral vision. Okay, and let's stop. We'll stop now. And did anybody see anything different this time? Or was it more or less the same?
Yes, if I can go first again. So that one seemed much more regular. It was moving top right to bottom left. I still had the bottom left. It disappeared for a flash. So I don't know if that's just me. But, seems to be. But yeah, that one seemed much more regular. Except there was a kind of occasionally it was lower. But generally speaking, it was top right, bottom left, bottom right. Yeah, up that way. That was it.
Okay. Okay. Good. Good. Anyone else?
I think Vanessa would like to go.
Yes, this one I noticed was more diagonal, and in the very beginning, it seemed to make a little like curly loop towards the upper right corner, and that kind of dissipated, and it did seem to vary its speed a little bit. Like maybe it may have gone the same. I can't think of the thing physically where it may have equaled out, where it may have gone a longer distance quicker, and the shorter distance it maybe like slowed down a bit. But
Okay.
like I said, this was more of a diagonal, and where it went to the upper right corner, then kind of sloping down towards the lower left.
Okay. All right. Right. Anyone else? We don't have to go go. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just that's similar. I had a similar experience with that particular image.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So basically, we had two different slides. They were different, although they looked somewhat similar. So the first slide, let me put it up, and we're just going to go. I want to put, and this time we're going to actually look at. So what I want people to do now this time, and this is the first slide. Okay, I want you to focus on the right side only. Okay, and look at the motion of it. Okay, most of you will realize that it's basically going up and down. Okay, but to many people, it was not going in that simple of a pattern. For some of you, it was moving in a diagonal direction. For others, it was moving in a circular direction. So it had much more complex movement for most people. It was not as simple as it actually is. So let me go to the next one. All right. So the next one, if you again focus on the right side, you'll be able to see very clearly it is moving in a very simple diagonal direction. Right. If you follow it along with your finger, you can see it's moving in a diagonal direction from the bottom left to the top right. Just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And, the black and white shading of this sphere, you might say, or circle, you might say, is alternating, which is actually part of the illusion, part of what's causing illusion. So basically what's happening here is that between the two of them, here we're back to the first where it's moving up and down. The fact that it's alternating black and white while it's moving is causing interference into our visual system. There's too much information going into our brain. There's information about the black and white changing, and there's information about the movement of it. And there's actually a third element of, not a piece of information, but a third element of information. That is that I had asked each of you to look using your peripheral vision, meaning to keep staring at the black dot on the left, so that your peripheral vision was looking at it. So areas of our brain, areas of our eye and brain or visual system, which is, believe it or not, it's actually geared toward recognizing motion. It's highly tuned to motion. That area is very, very tuned to motion, but it's not tuned to very precise vision. So the fact that this is blurry really didn't make a difference, because those parts of our vision sees everything in blurry anyway. But it's really adept at seeing motion. Now, the problem here is that even though our peripheral vision is really good at seeing motion and the directions of motion, the types of motions, in this case, we were not good at seeing it. Most of us, there was interference where we saw this first image, which is simply going up and down, up and down. Okay, you can put your finger or something against the edge of it to see it's basically going simply up and down. And the fact that our visual system didn't see that, it saw more complex motion, either diagonal motion or circular motion, or horizontal, some aspect of horizontal motion, shows that our brain was modifying what actually is in reality. Reality is that this ball is moving up and down, but our brain did not see that. It saw a different version of reality. It basically modified what it saw. And in this case, it didn't modify it. And again, the modification doesn't have to be active. The modification can be passively done through interference or for many different mechanisms. So anyway, this is one example. So and the second one, you can see again, it's clearly moving diagonally. So again, although most people said they can more clearly see the movement in this, and again, it is because this coincides more with how the interference is less here, because the diagonal motion and the rotation of the colors are both kind of synchronized. You might not realize that, but it is a little more synchronized. So there's less interference. Here's another. We're going to switch to a different image, and in this case, there's going to be a green dot that appears. Okay, I want people to try to understand and to try to recognize, relative to the red dot, when does a green dot appear? Okay. So as the red dot is moving from left to right, the green dot appears at a certain time. So does it appear before so look at the location where the green dot appears. When the green dot appears, is the red dot to the left of it, or above it, or to the right of it? Okay. So when the green dot appears, think about whether the red dot is to the left of it, above it, or to the right of it. Okay, it's a very simple task. Okay, when the green dot appears. So that's all. Okay. So hopefully everybody had a chance to look at this. I'm going to pause and we'll go back to trying to get an assessment. So DLJ, what's your thought?
Yeah, just to comment on the previous one. just quickly. I moved my focus of attention even further left when you were running it, running it again. The more left I moved my focal point, the more horizontal that movement became.
Right.
How weird.
So
Okay,
that was increased interference. So our visual system is very complicated, but our visual system, like people are aware of frogs and how frogs can spot a moving fly and direct their tongue exactly to the right location. Those aspects of vision we still have in us, although they usually don't occur. But because our visual system is attuned to looking at motion, and depending on how far it is from the center of our vision, there are many interfering aspects to that image that's causing a lot of what happens. So as you move farther afield, farther away from the actual motion, the interference gets worse and worse. So I can't explain exactly why, but that I suspect is why that happened for you.
Okay, thanks.
So with this red and green dot, so let's talk about that.
So for the red green, I'm not sure if I'm getting a lag as to whether that's supposed to be a smooth red dot, because it was very jittery for me, and the green dot didn't appear every time. Was that supposed to happen? So I only got the green dot occasionally, and when it did appear, it was intermittently fractionally ahead, then the green dot was directly under and then the next one the green was slightly behind, and then that pattern repeated.
Okay, so the green dot appears every time the red goes next to it. So that's an artifact of Zoom. For some reason, Zoom is not.
Right. I got a lag. So it was only every fourth time or so that the red dot went across, and it was the pattern of slightly ahead, directly under, slightly behind, and then it repeated. That's what I got.
So you saw it, sometimes it was ahead of the green, other times it was on top, and other times it was further after the green. That's what you saw?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
In a sequential pattern.
Vanessa, let's. So let me. Would it help if I put that video back up so people can see it as we speak? I don't know if let me put it back up just to and I can pull it back but we'll keep it running and probably Zoom will stabilize after a while. I mean, the video may become more. Sorry, let me.
Well, say in my case, when I noticed it was always below, and sometimes there was a lag, like I was trying to catch up, like ever so slightly. And a few times maybe like there would be like the anomaly if it was to the right. When I, like you said, zoom a few times, it didn't appear up. And real quick about the prior one, when I looked halfway in between, it looked like a zigzag for the one that was going up and down with the dot. It was, like I said, it was less distortion, but it was like a zigzag as opposed, so whether the brain was halfway there, what reality was.
Okay. All right. So for the red green again, there's a lag. So what do you mean? You mentioned lag. What do you mean by lag? Is it before or after?
After. It's like the green was trying to catch up, only slightly. It wasn't like it was super behind. Like it maybe slightly aligned. Like if you were, running behind someone or like side by side, you may lose a step, but you would still be somewhat aligned with them, just not perfectly.
Okay. All right.
And I'm not seeing any green dot. It might be.
Right now, you're not seeing any green dot?
I'm just seeing the red one going along. Now it just popped up. Past
okay,
one.
Then the Zoom is kind of dropping a lot of frames. I'm not sure why.
So Peter has his hand up.
What's that?
Peter has his hand up.
Yeah, I chose. There's an option in Zoom you can optimize it for video, but maybe I can try it without optimizing. I don't know if it's the optimization is causing it to undo. Peter, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah. Okay. So I was actually looking at both of your demonstrations, Sanjay. The one that people claimed it was zigzag. I also saw the same thing. Like depending on where my focal point was, okay, and as well as the one you showed. But so just first things first, like if you could put a link to whatever you were showing, so people can actually watch it like real time. No offense, but Zoom is probably doing this favor for you. But also I was also looking at this chat that Julie put in the chat. I'm not sure how many of you can see this. It's at 6:07, something like that. But and then looking at the chat by Julie, and then looking from the demonstrations you gave, Sanjay, right? I'm beginning to really think, but I'm just extrapolating what I'm seeing here. So forgive me if you think this is off topic, but I'm trying to keep this on topic. This really just proves even more that we really can't rely on eyewitness testimonies. Does that make
You
sense?
can't what?
We really can't rely on eyewitnesses' testimonies in the court because, well, I mean, the fact that we're looking at two things or one thing moving, right, depending on which video you're thinking of, it's simplistic enough, right? And depending on the focal point, we're seeing kind of different things. What are, what the reality? And when you're actually thinking about it logically, how complicated it is if you are a witness of a crime, how much more things there are to go on, right? So it's, and I hope you understand what I'm connecting the dots with this. It's like I hate to make it sound like that no humans are trustworthy unless you're a camera, because then you have deep fake technology. But this double edge and everything. But you just kind of proved that point for me, to be honest. And there's one more thing that I can just say really quickly is that I know this is not directly related, but this does remind me of experiment, which is most often named the fake limb experiment, right? The prosthetics, right? When you
Phantom limb,
like when you have like that little sheet of wall, you can't see through it. Like, I mean, of course, it can't be transparent, right? Your real arm is on the other side of the little wall divider, and then the fake arm is attached to your shoulder, but it looks really real. And the idea is that you brush the fake hand with the real hand, right? Which you can't see a real hand for obvious reasons. You do this enough, and you distract the person, volunteer, enough times for a couple minutes, because if you do this like right away, no one's going to fall for it. But eventually, you convince the brain that this fake arm is your arm, right? This is the science of modern prosthetics with from MIT, all that kind of stuff. So even though there are no nerves, and then you take a hammer, you hit the fake hand, everyone jumps. It's like, holy shit, that's my, and if they realize that's not my real arm. So your experiment kind of reminds me of that.
Yeah, no, you're correct. I mean, your first point about the variability and possibly unreliability in our ability to observe the world, especially in terms of recounting or giving evidence or being reliable observers of the world. That's a known severe limitation in people. Evidence, when people give in any kind of case, this is one of the reasons why in the scientific field, people are not considered reliable. You have to have controlled studies with very sophisticated controls to kind of tease out these flaws and limitations in our perceptual systems. Just when you mentioned about putting the links, I did put a link to all three of these in the chat. So if anybody wants to look at it, you'll be able to pull it up on your hopefully your system. I put the exact
really
graphics so you can. What's that?
Really quickly, Sanjay, how is this similar to the study where a monkey appears in the middle with all the individuals that are dribbling a basketball? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
And
so,
how
I mean,
similar?
These are different processes. I mean, basically, in that situation, what's happening is that you are discarding information. So the premise of the discussion is the same, in that your brain is discarding information that it doesn't feel is important. So, but that example, actually, that's a very good example, because that goes into with more sophisticated environments in which we exist. For example, and for people who have not seen that video, I suspect most people have, but for anyone who hasn't, it's a famous 30-second clip, I think, where basically there are a bunch of people on a basketball court moving around in random ways, throwing balls to each other, and you're asked to try to keep track of where the ball is. You're asked to keep track of the basketball as it moves. And something happens in the background, and most people tend to miss this very significant activity which happens in the background because you're paying attention to the basketball movement. And after the fact, it's revealed. So I'm going to give a spoiler if you haven't seen it. Sorry, but it's a pretty famous one. If you want not to have a spoiler, just mute for about 30 seconds and then unmute yourself after that. But anyway, so during this session with basketball jumping around, what happens is there's actually a person dressed in a gorilla costume who kind of moves from left to right within the field. And they kind of move around and they stay in the middle and then they eventually move off screen. And the reality is that most people miss that. Some people do observe it, and nobody's told what to look for. They're told to look only for the basketball. But most people miss this hidden aspect of that scene. And that's an example where in the real world, the world has so much information around it, and our mind is trying to make conscious sense of that information. So in that example, we're getting at the exact nature of consciousness, because the conscious mind is told to focus on the basketball. So the conscious mind does try to focus on the basketball. And because our mind is limited in how much information it can grapple at any given time, again, this is a video. It's a video scene with lots of motion going on. So video and motion has a lot of information in it. When we talk about 10 or 15 people, they're all wearing different colored clothing, they're moving in different directions, the basketball is moving in a lot of different directions. So there's a lot of information in this video that's happening. And a single person's brain, most of the time, cannot keep track of all of that information. So in its attempt to consciously focus on the basketball, the brain literally ignores a lot more activity in the background, and therefore it misses this significant behavior that happens in the background. And that happens all of the time with us. This is not just during situations like that. This is a part of our conscious reality. Our consciousness doesn't really capture a lot of reality. So just to go back to the red and green dot, we talked about the other two, but the red and green dot, the reality, and anyone who pulled up the actual animation, it should appear on any device that you're using. It's a GIF, so it should appear. What you'll see is that as the green dot flashes, the red dot, for most people, it appears to actually come afterwards. And many people said that for DLJ, it sometimes appeared before, but I think that was an artifact of the delay. So, we can't rely on that as much. But nonetheless, the point is that.
Can I report back? Now I've called it up. Thanks for that. Thanks, Peter, for the suggestion as well, because I am seeing it a very smooth red line now, where it wasn't before. And every time I'm seeing the green dot appear directly underneath the red.
Okay.
I've even put my cursor on the green dot just because I can do that now.
Okay.
And that's every time exactly directly under.
Okay. So using a cursor is kind of cheating because a cursor focuses our mind, right? But if you didn't use the cursor there, if you relied simply on our visual system, you might not be able to sound. So basically, the gist of that third animation is that, and this is what happens with most people, especially if you don't use a cursor or use your finger to kind of pay attention. Because if you focus your mind at that instant using a tool like a finger or a cursor, you get more information. But if you allow the motion to basically, because our brain is trying to keep track of motion, for most people, what happens is, with the sensation we get is that the red dot, at the time the green appears, the red dot is to the right of the green, meaning the green dot flashes after the red has passed over it. So the red has moved to the right of the green dot when it appears. That's what most people see. And this is, and the truth is, if you were able to look at this video, if you were able to stop, and you can actually, if you have the computer tools, you can actually edit and look at the exact frame by frame. The green dot appears exactly and only when the red dot appears. So there's a single frame.
Sanjay, can I just report something else that I've just noticed? If I tilt my head, so my eyes are not horizontal anymore. So I've tilted my head to the left, and the red dot is appearing, hang on, after. If I tilt my head to the right, it's appearing before. So the orientation of my eyes actually also makes a difference.
Yeah.
Weird, man. Well done.
Yeah, so there are a lot of complex behaviors that we'll see out of this. And it does depend on, I mean, the orientation is one of those things that, because orientation, well, I mean, so something that I haven't gone into yet right now, but when I mentioned time, time is inherent in our brain, okay? Especially when there's movement, especially when there's motion. So time is something that our brain intuitively recognizes, but also the flow of time depends on the object or objects that we're seeing move. So if you tilt your head in a certain angle, that movement of that red dot changes, and the nature of the speed of time actually shifts a little bit, because if you're looking at it moving diagonally versus moving horizontally, it appears to move slower or faster, even though it isn't. You know, if your mind was able to measure time very precisely, which it is not, our mind warps time also. Our brain, and especially our sense of reality, warps the perception of time and the speed of time. That's an aspect of the tilting of the head. So anyway, I don't want to go too much into that. I want to get back onto the main topic. But
I was going to ask you, so how does this relate to survivability? So to connect the dots, no pun intended.
So what all of these three examples are showing, especially the third example, is that the perception of time and the perception of when things happen, our brain distorts. So our visual system and the deeper parts of our brain actually get the correct information that the red and green appear at the exact same time. But our awareness is warped. Our awareness is that the red comes after the green, okay, that it's to the right of the green. And this happens with most people most of the time. And for some people who are extremely acute, or their consciousness is of a different level, or they might actually be, the signal in their subconscious may actually be stronger for them. So whatever it is, you know, for some people, they can detect this much better. But majority of people, and it has nothing to do with good or bad. It's not an aspect of your visual system being better or worse. It's just the nature, experiences that you've had, and it could be even differences in brain processing. But whatever it is, for the average human being, the brain, in this specific case, it's delaying the information. And in that case, the delay is roughly 100 milliseconds. Okay, so that's the most finest granulation that we can see, where this happens in almost everybody. So this is a simple example where everyone's brain warps reality by at least 100 milliseconds. Okay, and you can come up with scenarios and examples where it actually happens more than that. So what that tells us is that if our brain can warp the perception of time, and if you tilt your head, it can actually warp the perception of space too, because it can make it appear before rather than after. And you can do a lot of, so it can actually warp this sense of time and space. So there are many things that depending on how you come up with this, it's not optical illusion. Believe it or not, this is not an optical illusion. It's a real thing. If you look at the actual frame, there's no illusion there. But our brain is sensing it incorrectly. Or another way to put it, our brain is sensing it in a way that helps us to, well, it doesn't help us in the way that the brain can process it.
So how does this relate to skydiving and base jumping, where people describe that time seems slow?
So I mean, so I'm not going to go too much into that, but when we're doing things like high adrenaline activities, the adrenaline actually changes the amount of processing that our brain can do. Adrenaline actually energizes certain areas of our brain. It activates and heightens awareness, and so when you're skydiving, you're literally in a threatening situation. You know, that's why adrenaline happens, because you recognize that you might die. So that's a different scenario. I don't want to go too much into that. It's a valid question, but that's not the normal sense that we're in. But again, that's a situation where our brain compensates for, and it doesn't warp as much, meaning the information that your visual system is getting is probably more accurate than in a non-threatening situation. Right now, when we're watching this moving red and green dot, you know, most of us are not in a threatening situation. Our brain is relaxed, and it doesn't have to. There's no dire situation that if you make a mistake, you're going to die. But in a skydiving situation, you very well may, if you miss something, some information very important, you can actually take a decision which puts your life in jeopardy. So different situation, so your brain's acuity and sense of timing, all these things can shift. So the warping effect of our brain and consciousness, that's the point here, that even a skydiving example that you raised elucidates that our brain can change reality based on what it needs to do. And in a situation where survival is really critical, it undoes. So for example, if you've ever been in a serious accident, auto accident, I was in one years and years ago, where time literally slowed down. This is one of the reasons why, because the brain realizes it's in a threatening situation, and the type of processing that it does changes where it doesn't need to, or it doesn't warp time to the extent that it does normally. So anyway, let me get back to the slides. We're going to
let me ask really one quick question. Is that, all right, we have this lag, right, that exists, or this misperception of reality. So then how does the idea of prediction kind of fit into this as far as survivability goes, then our senses, and how that, our brains are considered prediction machines, and that is related to survivability directly. So then, what's the relationship between those two? I think it's important to clarify.
So excellent question. I have some slides coming up which I'll go directly into that.
Okay, good.
So I won't directly touch into it right now, but excellent point. We'll get into that. So just in terms of, let me get the slides back on track. I believe this is, I think everybody should be able to see the slides again. So consciousness collects and discards information. Okay, so out of everything that we've seen so far, it collects information and it discards information. And depending on the situation we're in, for example, if you're in a skydiving situation, or if you're in an accident, if you're in the middle of an accident, where the accident is ensuing, it's happening in real time, your brain recognizes that it shouldn't discard as much information. There may be information that's really critical, so it stops discarding some of the information. Or what it might do is, because the brain really still has to discard. Our brain is limited in how much information it can collect at any given time. So typically what happens is the brain, instead of collecting information of one type, for example, the amount of temperature that the air is, in an accident situation or a skydiving situation, your brain may actually no longer collect the information about the temperature, because if it's cold, it doesn't really matter, because there are more serious things that are happening. You're falling at a very rapid rate, or you're in the middle of an accident, so the temperature may no longer be important. So your brain discards other information. It still collects information and it still discards information, but which information prioritizes may change. Okay. Another example I gave with the cut, you have a cut on your finger, and the sensation of pain and damage, that can change. So the awareness, for simplest organisms, the type of information that the brain collects at a conscious level, this is a simple level of consciousness, is your body's state, okay, the state of your body. So we talk about pain and damage, but this actually goes more into other types of information. So whether you're in a threatening situation, again, if you're in a dangerous situation, it doesn't have to be a threat from another organism. It can be that you're falling off of a cliff, or skydiving, which is simulating that. If you have food around you or not, if you're starving, mate selection. In general, safety and comfort. This is the idea that these are around, is that if you're in a state of safety and comfort versus you're not, then the type of information you collect and the extent of information you collect, the speed at which you collect that information will change. So the sense of reality that you have can change based on all of these situations. It does change. It's always that the reality is a subset of truth, a subset of what is actually out there. But the part of reality that you're absorbing and collecting at any given time depends on your internal state, depends on the environment, depends on the situation you're in, depends on your physical body state, all of these things. There's another video that I have, which I'll skip. I mean, if people want to go a little more into that, I can. It's about a 1-minute clip. But anyway, so, and that goes into some more about why do we have pain. Pain is pain and damage, body damage, as one of the central, I believe, and there's a school of thought in the neurosciences which believes that one of the foundations of consciousness is it was driven out of this need for survival. And a lot of the consequential actions and events and behaviors that happen out of consciousness, happen during consciousness, can be seen when we look at it from this perspective. So that video that I have, a person is basically talking about it. They're not talking from a philosophical sense, but they're basically describing it. It's a biologist who's talking about the need for us to detect pain and damage, bodily damage. And for our conscious mind to know when we have pain or not know when we have pain or we have damage, this is a foundational need that every organism has. The example I gave earlier, where organism is in a fight, in a tussle with another organism, it gets damaged. It has to know that its body is damaged. If it doesn't know that, and it kind of continues working in the world the way it always does, and one of its limbs is broken, it's not going to be able to function very well. That broken limb is going to inhibit a lot of the behaviors it can engage in, and that will probably put it in threat. If it has to evade and run away from something, or if it has to chase something to find food, it will not be able to. So that damaged limb, it's important for it to know. So in consciousness, we need to know the state of our body. That's one of the first precursor types of information that our brain has to have, that our conscious aspects of our brain and awareness has to have, is the state of our body. So that's why I have that highest in this hierarchy. The next level of information is about the environment and the things around us, threats around us, level of food and mate selection and safety and comfort, all of the other things in the environment around us, not just our internal, but the environment around us. That's the next level of information that our consciousness needs to collect, because that helps in our survival. And for longer term survival, there's a lot of other information that it collects, and that information that it collects and the processing of the information doesn't have to happen in real time. And again, these are much more complex processing when you're in a complex situation. For example, when we have to go grocery shopping, that's a complex situation. We don't have to forage for food. We basically buy our food, or we acquire our food. We transport it to our residence. We put it into a fridge, and it's stored there. And then later in the future, we pull it out of the fridge when it's time to eat or when it's time to cook, right? So that's a more complex situation around food. And we have to do planning for when are we going to collect the food or when are we going to cook, right? We built this schedule around ourselves where I'm going to have 3 meals a day or maybe 5 or 6 smaller meals a day, right? So we built this predictive planning type of situation in our lives where around eating. A simple organism doesn't do that, but a complex organism does do that. So this is the more complex nature of survival with a more complex brain in a complex environment, where once you understand and master your environment and you have ready access to food, you don't have to go every day hunting for food or foraging for food in the forest. You no longer have to do that. You can do a lot more planning. So at the bottom, the complex situations that we're in come down to having a more complex brain. And again, these have to do with our ability to plan things, our ability to predict things. And this is a key concept. Our brain automatically does this. We don't do this actively, that our brain is always comparing the planning that our brain is doing subconsciously and the predicting that our brain is doing subconsciously, as well as the observing that our brain is doing in pseudo real time. Okay, the comparison between what we're seeing and what we're planning and what we're predicting, that comparison, or the multiple levels of comparison, is something that's important. I'm going to go into that next on the next slide. But before that, let me go a little more into we're going to go, and this is near the end of the talk, so we're going to have discussion after this. There's, I think, two more slides after this. So consciousness consists of internal behaviors. Something to really understand is that consciousness is a set of behaviors. Okay, consciousness is not a thing, and I'm talking about all levels of consciousness. And the types of behaviors that are involved in consciousness depends on the type of organism you are, types of neural circuitry that you have, whether it's a complex brain or a simple, network and neurons. So the internal behaviors can be short-term, immediate, or they can be long-term based on memory. So a lot of internal behaviors inside the brain, internal meaning inside the brain, doesn't have to be subconscious. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about all these behaviors happen inside the neuronal circuitry of that organism. So while we're conscious, while we're aware, a series of events or a series of activities must keep occurring. This is the idea that's important. Okay, so one of those series of activities is sensory information. You have to keep collecting sensory information about where am I, or for more complex organisms, time. What time is it, or is it daytime or nighttime, or is it the same? Because your mind can lose track of time. There's situations that happen where your mind loses track of time, especially after you go to sleep, right? You wake up. So you have to have an awareness of how long time has passed. So the location of where you are in space, in your environment, in your recognized environment, this is important to sensory information. The moment of time that you're in, is it a few seconds from the last time that you assessed your environment, or is it a day after, or is it a long time after? These are very low-level information that a lot of sophisticated organisms have in their brain. And there's many other types of information, sensory information that we collect, but in general, this is the type of sense that it gives us of the world. Okay, we're collecting immediately the world. Then after collecting that information, the brain is assimilating it and combining it and forming a perception, not just a sensation, but it's forming a perception of, and I've talked about this in the past. And with that perception comes a context of where am I? Oh, I'm sitting in this room. I'm sitting on a chair. I'm on a Zoom call. That's the awareness, the context of the situation. You have a realization. The realization happens in your conscious mind, conscious part of the mind. But again, there are a lot of behaviors around that. And again, the behaviors that we're talking about is that there's information that comes into our brain. The information goes in specific regions of the brain. And the information is taken or moves within the brain in different ways. Some information moves, other information doesn't move. That again gets into which information gets ignored by the brain or dropped by the brain, and which information the brain focuses on. Because the conscious activity or the consciousness, the creation of consciousness in us, depends on which pieces of information within this vast brain network that we have that our conscious areas pull in and assimilate and consolidate versus they don't. Okay, our brain is consolidating and assimilating some of the information that it's gotten from the outside and some of the information it's gotten from our memories. So whatever subset of information it's assimilating, that helps us form this conception of our present instant reality. That's an important idea to recognize. And based on that conception of reality, only then can we do planning, only then can we do predicting, and only then can we do comparing. So these are steps inside of our brain that happen in most all non-trivial brains that happen. The third step, again, while we're conscious, is that, and this is my version of way of explaining it, is a sense of comfort. Okay, so when we observe reality, right, the information that we're getting from reality, a subset of information, not full information, it goes into our brain. And then based on the prior information, not just what we're getting now, but what we had gotten 10 seconds ago, the information we got 10 seconds ago is still in our brain, and that information is used to predict what should happen. For example, when a frog predicts that there's a fly in space in front of it, it's predicting where that fly is going to move because it needs to eat that fly. So its mind is using the prior information of where the fly was 10 seconds ago, or actually it's not even 10 seconds, it's milliseconds ago, okay? And because its prediction ability is so fast, because for it to eat and get that tasty fly, it has to do it so quickly. So it's predicting where the fly will be. And remember, its visual system is not as accurate. It is more accurate than humans, but it's still not perfectly accurate. It can't rely on its eyes to know where the fly actually is right now. What it does is it extrapolates. And again, this is very simple mathematics, okay? And there are examples we can use to show this, that a linear transformation where using time, you can very accurately predict motion if the motion is of a fixed velocity, or if it's accelerating motion and the organism knows that that fly is accelerating, then it can predict it. But in the case of acceleration, moving on a curve is also acceleration. So this is one of the reasons why frogs can even catch a fly, even if the fly is curving in its flight path. Because even though it's accelerating along that curved path, the frog has learned how to predict curvature of motion. It's learned that inherently in its brain. So that's why it's so good at catching flies, because it's predicting the motion of that fly. It's not observing it in real time. It can't observe it in real time. It's relying it based on its predictive ability. And the predictive ability is good enough. But what it's doing is it's comparing its prediction with what it actually sees. And inside of the mind, it shifts time slightly. So it knows that what it's seeing right now, actually, I shouldn't say it knows, it realizes later that what it's seeing is off. Okay? So this comparison of the prediction actually has to account for this delay in time. So in a frog's comparison of its prediction is much more sophisticated than you might say humans, because most of us are not aware that our reality is shifted in time. Most of us don't understand that. If you would ask us inherently, do we see reality as it occurs? Everybody would say yes. But the reality is we don't see it as it occurs. We see it delayed, and sometimes we see it even a second delayed. I mean, not just milliseconds, even a second, or in extreme cases, even 2 seconds delayed. So this comparison is very important. Now, the point why I'm focusing on this comparison is that comparison basically results in either a sense of comfort, and I'm using the word comfort, but it's more complicated than that. It's basically, you might say, a set of neuronal constructs. You can think of it as a feeling, but it's really not the same as an emotional feeling. It's a emotional state that arises in the brain, particularly in the conscious part of the brain, which we recognize as either comfort or dissonance. Okay, so if our prediction of reality matches, then we have a low-level sense of comfort. We don't think of it as comfortable, but we feel in tune with reality. We feel as if everything's fine in the world. But if something happens that jars us, gives us a jarring sense of reality, that's where there's a dissonance between our predictive and actual observation. The comparison doesn't match, and it gives us a jarring feeling where it might sometimes come out as confusion. That we get confused. That doesn't make sense. Like after you wake up and you feel groggy, you don't remember where you fell asleep, or you don't remember where you were when you fell asleep. And what you're seeing is different from what you remember where you fell asleep. And there's a dissonance in that. It causes confusion. And so this word comfort don't think of it in a simple way. It's much more complicated than simple comfort. It can lead to a dissonance. It can lead to a stress or distress or eustress. It can lead to confusion. It leads to many different types of, you might say, emotions in the brain. But fundamentally, this is one of the main things about consciousness that I believe consciousness arose to create, because this lets us modify our behavior in the future based on whether we feel comfortable in the moment or not. If we don't feel comfortable, we change our behavior because there's something wrong with our understanding of reality. And for survival, our understanding of reality has to be as correct as it can be. When you're skydiving, your reality has to be as correct as it can be. When that frog is trying to catch that fly, its sense of reality has to be as correct as it can be, otherwise it won't catch the fly. So for survival to be optimal, especially in a dynamic environment, then this comfort signal, it's a signal that happens inside of our area of consciousness. Okay, and again, this happens at a higher level than at this, the simplest level of consciousness. This is, I would say it's more of a mid-tier type of signal that occurs in a lot of organisms. But the signal of, am I comfortable with reality or not? Or what I'm sensing, is it okay or not? Does it make sense or not? That signal is vital to us. And one of the things, just an example that I'm going to give in this, and then if you think of an infant, human infant, okay, human babies don't understand reality. They don't, because they're just born. The first week, the first month, even the first 6 months, They have a very limited understanding of what reality is. They see things, they see movement, they see, and they smell things. They kind of start to recognize their parents or caretakers. They start to recognize certain things. But in the first week or so, they're really not recognizing much. But what they do recognize is their bodily sensations. So this comfort feeling, a lot of what a baby's comfort feeling comes from is its body, not from the sensory world outside. So at its earliest stage of life, a baby is focusing, remember the prior slide that I have, where what we're doing is we're focusing on awareness of internal. Okay, now a baby doesn't always have pain and damage, rarely does it have pain and damage, but if it's hungry, right, or if its diaper is wet, that gives a sensation, and that's why it cries, because those sensations cause discomfort in the brain, and the discomfort through evolution, the brain of a baby, of a human baby, or many mammals, has been trained to do something like cry when it feels discomfort. Okay, that's the reason why babies cry when they have certain types of discomfort, because it's been trained into us through evolution, because that crying gets attention of a caregiver, and that caregiver fixes whatever is causing us that discomfort. So this is an example where the baby is actually trying to comfort itself. It's trying to normalize that discomfort that it feels. And that's the reason why, it doesn't know it has to cry. It doesn't even know what crying is. Its brain is doing the crying for it, because its brain is getting this signal, which makes it do this crying behavior. It's not aware it's crying. Okay, I mean, or I should say, it's the awareness it's crying is probably happening secondarily. As soon as it starts crying, the first time a baby cries, the first time ever in its life that it cries, the sound comes out of its mouth, right? And then its ear hears a sound, and it doesn't realize where the sound is coming from. It probably doesn't even know that it's its own sound, that it's the sound of its own crying. It might learn that and realize that that's its own sound. After a few times, after maybe a day or two or a week, it realizes that that's its own sound. But in the beginning, it doesn't even realize that the sound of its crying is its own. Its ear is hearing it. It's picking up the sound, but it's not aware of. That's the level of the lack of information of the early brain that an organism has. So anyway, so based on the agreement or disagreement in this comparison between the prediction of what it has and the information it's getting, the brain either feels comfort or discomfort, and based on that, it will warp reality to some extent. The last slide, this is a little more sophisticated, but I'll probably cover this slide in a future talk, because this is, I'm not going to go into it a lot, but this gets into much more sophisticated. This is much more at the primate and human level, where our representation of reality is symbolic. That's one thing that many mammals and all humans do, is we represent reality symbolically, and I put in this slide in terms of 3 levels. Symbolic interpretation, we understand and interpret the things around us. We see a tree or we see food, and we interpret it as a symbol, the symbol of food. We can see food in many, many different shapes and forms, but all of it symbolically is represented in the same sense in our brain. We don't have to recognize a fruit as different from a different type of food. Symbolically, all of it filters into the same type of symbolic representation of food. So that's a more sophisticated version of reality, where whether it's a pear or it's a sandwich, or even if it's water is a type of food, it's a type of nourishment. Any of those things, our brain would interpret in the same, a sophisticated brain, a human brain, would interpret all together in terms of the same context. The processing of these symbols. So our brain, even when our eyes are closed, we can process, we can imagine, what are we going to have for dinner tomorrow? Okay, that's an example of processing using symbols. The symbol of food. We can think of this type of food or that type of food without actually having to see it. So we use these symbols in our brain. And in terms of what I mean by a map here is not necessarily a physical map. It can be a map in time. It can be a map in space. It can be a map across our social world. For example, the symbol is held by somebody. We go to someone's house, right? So that is both a physical map where that person's house is in a geographic location, but also it's a symbolic map of society where that person is a connection with us, has a connection with us. So that word map also has multiple meanings here, but again, it's symbolic processing. And then the symbolic existence that we have, this is at the highest level where our definition and understanding of reality is actually based purely almost on symbolic processing. And because these symbols can be warped or these symbols can be shifted in time and space, we can warp our reality. And now, as we have the internet, we can live in pretty much a virtual existence because of all of these things. So anyway, let's stop here. A lot of questions, I suspect. So I'll pause for now, and I'm sure we're gonna have a lot of questions. But the last slide, let's hold off on that. I'll probably do it. Most likely, we'll do a talk subsequently on that. But the prior areas where processing, comparison, confusion, comfort, these types of ideas, let's delve a little more into these.
So we have Peter, Ben, and DLJ.
Oh yeah, I was thank you, Sanjay. I was gonna because you talked about the baby crying, and the first thing I realized is obviously how is it compared to other animals. I'm sure you already know this, but other animals, I'm not saying all, but certain, do quote unquote cry. I'm doing the air quote because it's not the same thing as human crying, right? Like for example, when a new rabbit is I don't know what you call it, baby rabbit is born, or like a new bird is born from the egg, right? It definitely makes like noises, but at the same time, other animals don't really make that much noise at all. I understand the deer, it kind of beats when they were, I don't know how you spell it, BLEAT, when they were born, but other animals are really completely silent, and I'm not talking about insects. So just that, but also another reason for human babies to cry is because when the umbilical cord is severed after birth, right, like not coming out of the vaginal walls, but vaginal walls, but like when the umbilical cord is severed, it's actually it's a rapid increase in carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. And to compensate for that, the human brain, the level of the pons, right, PONS, that signals the muscles and diaphragms to start contracting the first breath. Therefore, it's possible to actually cry now. And plus, you're not in a liquid-like, location, right? So you can actually make that. So that's why it cries. But you are correct on the point, Sanjay. And also another thing I want to say is kind of from your presentation and also just briefly reading on everyone see what Julie posted her really, really long one, I guess, that comment. And this is where I'm gonna say like and I mean she's not wrong for humans, right? It says yet because the vision is preferred or most relied sense, right? Except that part. Well, this just happens to be where most humans live, where there's a lot of light, right? Think about, I mean, we can speculate safely, scientifically, what would happen if you have generations of humans living on a planet where it's just dark, right? Underground or under the ocean. And you can bet the different senses will be more used than vision over time because environment directly affects what kind of senses we use primarily, right? Not only. And last but not least, the last question she also asked, what about catching a spinning baseball? I'm assuming that's the question that's kind of asked as soon as I replied to her. It says, this is why blind people often have better hearing than non-blind people over time. So I'm assuming that's the question kind of going asking about that. So this is where the advantage of other animals, right? For example, Tyrannosaurus Rex is still the king of smell. Meaning that smell is, exactly where the different species is. So that's kind of how you differentiate where without really sight. And last but not least, I'm sure we all know how dolphins communicate and bats, right? The sonars, the quote unquote technology. Some humans are able to kind of do the quote unquote sonar thing, but we can safely say that overall as a species, we don't exactly have that. At least not to the ability to survive. So it's environment versus senses. So we're running a little bit behind schedule here. So if everybody can keep comments to a minimum so that we can then just close out. So
yeah,
Ben,
I just want to make a comment on what Peter said. So when I talked about crying with babies, I mean I gave the example of humans, but yes, the point was that and crying has multiple purposes. That's you get into that. I don't when I talk about or give examples, it's very difficult to go into all of the different scenarios, but crying, as you said, is autonomically automatic when we need oxygen or in certain situations. So as a baby emerges from the womb from a purely liquid environment into a purely air environment, that is, again, that's driven by genetics and evolutionary genetics, where most animals instantly have to change its physiology of its lung and kind of expel the liquid in its lung and try to breathe. So that's an aspect of crying also. But what I was talking about is in general communicating, because an organism that's under stress, a baby that's under stress, it has its body is urine and feces is acidic. It actually is caustic. If you leave it on the skin, it disturbs our skin. It itches our skin. So the baby will sense that. Or if it's hungry, so all of these. So the communication aspect, it doesn't have. I'm not saying it necessarily has to be like a human like crying. Some organisms, some animals, especially if they live in in an environment where sound would reveal their location to predators, so they would not make a sound. But they may give off pheromones, they may give off chemical signals to their parents, or they may give off other types of information, communicate in a way to their parents to bring attention. So yeah, the human example I gave, because we typically are not in those situations, but in general, the idea is that an infant organism of a species has to communicate when it's under distress, or depending on the sophistication. Many organisms don't need help from their parents. Human babies need help from their parents because they're basically helpless at the beginning. But many other sophisticated mammals are not as helpless. They can actually function on their own. Even they can forage and find food on their own. So they probably will not be engaging in some of these behaviors. So yeah, the examples I gave are not across the animal kingdom, but they're to show. They were to show this idea around comfort in the brain, and that aspect exists in all animals, and including the human infants.
Thank you.
Ben.
It seems. Hi, yeah, thanks. It seems to me like a lot of the talk was revolving around pointing out fallacies in our ability to make valid observations with our consciousness, and not very much around our abilities to make valid observations with our consciousness. And I can think of a lot of things where I'm able to identify, like I can look at this, it's a rock. I can look at that, that's a bird or a chicken. I can identify millions of things with my eyes, with my nose. And when you start talking about epistemology and whether or not we can make valid assessments with our senses, then you run into the point where people start saying, okay, nothing is observable, and I can just make any point I want. Like I once was talking to a creationist who thought that dinosaurs existed with Jesus. And he basically said that all of the scientific observations were dependent ultimately on our senses, and therefore moot, basically. So I find it's a slippery slope, and I'm wondering why so much effort was put into it in this talk.
So I mean, most people. So I had to take the approach that most people, when they think of consciousness, they think of consciousness as this perfect capturing of reality. Okay, so that's a default that most of us start with. So yes, what you said is true, that consciousness doesn't necessarily warp always to the negative. It doesn't always lose. It does always lose information, but it doesn't always lose information to give us a false sense of reality. At some level, it has to give a correct version of reality to help us survive. That's the whole point of why consciousness is there. But what I, and it's I started rushing toward the end of it, but basically the idea I want to leave behind, especially on this subpoint, is that it's not that consciousness gives us a false sense. I don't think I ever said it gives us a false sense of reality. What I'm saying is it gives us a subset of reality. And whether that subset of reality is useful or not useful, with the extent that it's useful or not useful, depends on the type of brain, the type of neural circuitry, the sophistication of the neural circuitry, the sophistication of the experience of that organism. For example, if it's an infant, it doesn't have experience, right? If it's 5 years old, it has more experience. If it's 30 years old, it has much more experience, right? So the extent of experience the extent of processing ability of its brain, the extent of memory, and the factualness of the memory of it, right? If it's lived in only one location and its experience has only encoded that information, then it moves to a completely strange and bizarre and totally different location. Its past experience might not help it in this new locale. So there's many factors here that come into play, whether our sense of reality and our understanding is useful or less useful or more useful. So the point around usefulness of our conscious information or conscious realization is very complicated. It's not that it's not useful. It's not that we always have a false or imperfect sense. We do have imperfect sense, but oftentimes that imperfect sense is good enough for us to do what we need. That's the key point. And I have to disagree with any notion that science is based on our senses. Science is absolutely not based on our senses. So anyone who believes that science does not rely on our conscious awareness of things. That's one of the reasons why. Anyway, that's a subtopic. But hopefully, Ben, you're understanding that I'm not saying that consciousness gives us a false sense, always gives us a false sense of reality. It can give us a false sense depending on our need, depending on the amount of energy we have at the time, depending on the urgency of where we are. There's many factors. So the key point is that the usefulness of the sense of reality that our conscious mind has, that a conscious mind has, depends on many variables, and the extent of usefulness and the correctness of it. Now, that correctness is modeled on the theoretical correctness of what actually is happening in the real world. That's an objective correctness. So if you're being chased and you believe there's more distance between you and the other animal, when the distance is not that far, if your version of reality is imperfect in that sense, there's a greater chance you'll die, right? Because you'll be caught, because you'll misestimate the distance between you and the predator. So it can help you, it can hurt you. There's no way for the organism itself to know other than through experience. So as an organism becomes more aware of how its own consciousness works, it should become better at using its consciousness, and it should become better at surviving in the world in which its consciousness was formed and trained. But if it goes to a different world where it's, the example I gave is you grow up in one area and your consciousness has formed and learned in one sense, and then you move to a completely different area, completely different environment, your awareness of consciousness might not help you. For example, the laws of driving in the US, we have laws of driving that are very controlled. And if you move to a different country where driving is more erratic, your conscious understanding of the driving laws may actually get you in trouble in that other country. Whereas if a person from that other country comes to the US, their understanding of chaotic rules of driving may actually help them in this country. So again, they're very complex. The warping of reality is a fundamental thing that every mind does. Whether it helps us or not depends on a lot of situations. So that's, I think, the underlying idea I want to leave. It can help, it can hurt. It's not one or the other, or even predominantly one or the other. It depends on the situation of the organism and their past. It depends on a lot of things.
DLJ and then Vanessa, and then we'll close it up. So everybody.
Thanks. So I appreciate we're over time, so I have to try and give you the short version of this question. That's killing me now because I really want to explain a lot.
Go ahead, give the long one. Go ahead.
Well, okay. So Sanjay, I don't know if you caught the presentation I did a few weeks ago for the Aussies. I think I saw you sign up, but I'm not sure you attended. But the event management process that I explained there fits perfectly with that perception of time thing. So I love it. The bit that I'm sorry, Joe, because this is going to delay the presentation you've been waiting for on consciousness, because I'm still trying to write it. Read versus write, or read write. So I'm okay with the idea that consciousness is a kind of real-time audit reporter. So that's a write facility, right? But is it read as well, right? Because I'm trying to think about different states, like when you're half asleep or when you're under anesthetic or maybe an animal's version of consciousness. Is the read facility, so reading the because you talk about creates the perceived perceived reality or the model of reality. So you're saying it creates that. I'm good with that. Different creatures create that model in different ways. You also need some element of being able to read that model. So it's the read versus the write. Are you including consciousness as both read and write, or are you would you separate the two as consciousness A, consciousness B, or what? Sorry, that is the long version. Apologies.
So let me try to understand what you mean by right version of consciousness. I mean, so if you think about it, think about it this way. So you're using the word, you're using the word consciousness and reality. Let me drill a little bit further, because in the brain, there isn't just one thing. So the brain has lots of information in it, right? Our senses give a more correct and complete version of reality, but a lot of that information resides throughout the brain in different regions. A lot of that never gets consolidated into the conscious part of our brain. Or if it does get to the conscious part of our brain, it gets there in a warped sense, or it gets there delayed, or it gets there in a different sense, or it sometimes doesn't get there. So when you're talking about read, there's two types of read. One read is that the information is getting into the dispersed areas of our brain. That's an act of reading. Our brain is reading reality. But then our consciousness is reading reality from the other parts of our brain. It's not reading from outside, it's reading from within our brain. Right? The conscious regions is reading from our brain. So the word read has more than one meaning here. I hope you understand what I'm saying by that. Okay? In the same way,
So,
right?
Monitoring is probably the more generic term, but yeah, go on.
So it's more than monitoring, it's actually copying. And it's selectively copying. And the selective copying is the resolution of information. So for example, if it hears audio, like the famous example where you hear this garbled audio recording, right? And you don't know what it is. It sounds like garbled, right? And then someone plays back and tells you, writes down on the screen what that garbled recording is. So you read it, and all of a sudden your brain has a map for what that audio actually is. It has an English context of placing. And then when you hear the exact same recording, now it sounds like those words, whereas before it sounded like garbled, right? So that's an example where when you're reading the information out of your perceptual memory, right? When you're reading it, that reading can be warped, or that reading can be read in at higher or lower resolution. So the reading isn't so simple. It's what happens inside our brain is so complicated at so many different levels, so it's not simply monitoring. It's reading, it's transforming, it's moving. There's many things. So that's why when I talk about behavior, consciousness is multiple types of behaviors of movement of information within the brain. On writing, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by writing, but in a simplest sense, what you might say is the term of monitoring is a form of taking in from one place and putting it to another. So the writing into the conscious center, you might think of that as writing. But there's much more, I think.
Copying is a good way of saying it. Yeah, so that's essentially what I meant. Okay, so it's both, and it's selective reading in order to clarify or to narrow down to like a high fidelity thing as opposed to low fidelity, right?
Well, not just fidelity. I mean, it can be any aspect of the information. It can be the speed, the sampling speed of the information. It can be even whether the information is ignored or not, right? So, for example, you have pain information about a paper cut. That information is completely dropped. It never gets into our consciousness until we see and we realize that we have that pain, right? That pain is completely dropped. It's not that it's selectively or at a lower resolution. It's just that it's not even picked up.
Right.
So the reading, a lot of complex nature around a lot of that. Excellent question.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Vanessa.
Yeah, I would say definitely that memory and repeat experience comes into it. You mentioned the baby. Maybe just because I'm a woman, the way my bosom is shaped, I may hold a baby where maybe it matches its mother's, and it'll be like sucking on my arm, and you tell you that it'll just keep sucking and it won't cry, realizing, wait, but there's no milk coming out. Figures, okay, maybe the more I suck, something will magically appear. But is there something like kind of like in the human body or the brain where it's like you splash cold water in your face, you're suddenly alert, like if your pulse is racing, you suddenly begin to feel that, and that may cause you to pause or something, a behavior that's an anomaly. Like I said, you know, humans, we're attracted to others, whether for reproduction or just the enjoying someone else's company and the solidarity, whatever you want to call it. I was having a conversation, and whether I just happened to glance a certain way, I realized, my gosh, I was playing with a hair. I wasn't purposely doing it, but I happened to notice and looking that, making like curls with my hair just repeatedly, the same hair. And like I said, unless I was drawn to that, and even like if you there'll be times when the brain realizes, wait, information's not matching up, where I'll wake up and thinking, oh my gosh, I slept like 10 hours. I feel so, and I'll look, it's like, holy crap, it was whether 45 minutes or 2 hours. Some of it realize, wait, the light does not agree with how my body thinks. If it's like 10 hours, the sun should be up. And initially there may be that thing, holy crap, I slept through the whole day. And then you look at the time, realize they don't match up. But there's that little thing where it doesn't match. Like you mentioned, the prediction and the reality don't jive, but it was enough for me to realize. And I also processed and realized, wait a minute, I didn't sleep a whole day, because between the time and this, there'd be too much anomalies for me to realize I had actually slept, let's say, 27 hours. But like I said, the brain then realized, wait, let me go think this through. So I mean, is that kind of why maybe it's like getting that slap of cold water, like, wait, but whether you have that little jerk, and maybe the brain takes the time to think it through, so to speak, rather than simply discarding it, not acknowledging it consciously. Is that something with the survival? Like there's a reason to realize, wait, like I said, the things don't quite match up, and let me hit pause and consider why. Like I said, the baby doesn't realize that because it hasn't had enough experience to realize, okay, if you're not tasting the milk or the warmth, maybe my sweat tasted good that day. Who knows? Maybe that was enjoyable for the kid with the salt. So maybe that's another reason I didn't even consider.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so when we get into more complex behavior of our daily lives, our sense of consciousness is very, very convoluted. There's so many things happening. We're not talking only about survival. And again, the part of this is the efficiency with which we can live, right? The efficiency with which we can operate within our day-to-day existence. So that's the area that we're talking about here. Not simply basic survival, but are we getting rest? And if we're getting rest, or we're distracted, and time passes, and we lose touch with how much time has passed, and all of a sudden we wake up and we realize time has passed, but we're not aware of how much time passed. So there's this initial state of confusion, and that initial state of confusion is a signal that goes into our consciousness, which forces us to pay attention and to home in, to alleviate that confusion, right? To alleviate this loss of information or lack of information. Because if we didn't have that signal, right, a simple organism might be confused, but it might continue to operate and not alleviate that confusion, and therefore it might make decisions that are not optimal because it's in a confused state. So the fact that that signal of confusion or that signal of discomfort makes us act on it to gather more information. For example, after we wake up and we're kind of, dozed off, and we wake up and we realize, we kind of turn our heads around and start looking to understand what's happening, how much has changed. We kind of assess how much time might have passed. We might even look at a watch or our phone or something, right? We try to get information to fill in the gaps of what we realize our information, our context of awareness has. Our awareness has a gap of information. And we hone in on what's the gap, and we hone in on how do we behave to fill that missing information. And once we've filled in the missing information, again, we can do comparison with the new information versus the old information. And if there's still a gap, we continue doing it until we're satisfied that our new sense of reality, our new awareness of reality is good enough, and then we move on. And if it's not good enough, then, then we'll act in a certain way. We might talk to someone and say, well, I don't understand what's happening. Like if you're totally confused, you might ask someone, a more sophisticated person might do that instead of relying simply on their senses. So the goal, your goal will be, your consciousness will give you the ability to do a lot more sophisticated things to eliminate this discomfort that is in our consciousness, the signal of discomfort that's in our consciousness, so that you can get the most accurate information to do whatever you need to do. And again, doing what you need to do is not basic survival anymore. It's more sophisticated levels of survival. But again, it's still a part of, it's still a part of system. If you can operate in a more sophisticated way among a group of people, that's still a part of survival. It's social survival. It's no longer physical survival, but it's still an aspect of survival. That's why survival, the word survival, in the title of this talk wasn't geared only around physical. It was also geared around emotional. It was also geared around social and many others. So the last slide that I had can be taken to span many, many, many different areas of our behavior.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, actually. I think that maybe that could be something for a future talk, is the idea of the social interactions that also go into survival specifically. And, things, even how we develop empathy through our experiences and things like that, our sympathy, if you will. But it was, fantastic talk as always, Sanjay. We have some upcoming events this week. On tomorrow, we will be covering Seneca's letters, and that will be at 8 o'clock. And on Friday, we will be having Design Your Life. And so mindfulness and meditation, actually, we'll be covering. That is on Friday. And then I don't this Sunday actually was with Kurt McNamara, and he's been gracious enough to, with our Bucky Inspired Comprehensivist Understanding, to understand and change the world, I should say. He is graciously agreed to appear once a month for us with systems, going over various systems thinking concepts. So that'll be on Sunday evening, and then we return on Monday with our Poetry Mondays. So I will see everybody in the coming days.
Can I make just a quick comment, Joe, to Sanjay, because I won't be back for a while, so I really enjoy this, Sanjay. I just want to say that because of your I think just human, but intelligence level in conjunction with our socialness and our senses is really what paints the broader picture of why we're the most successful species in the animal kingdom. Because a quick example is our eyes are pretty bad compared to some other animals, so we create fire, right? I mean, light bulb came like probably millions of years after, so we create fire, and then we create tripwires for animals that, early warning system for our lack of acute hearing, and then domestication of dogs that can increase smell, even though we can't obviously surgically change our noses. So that intelligence is really also a huge factor.
Yeah, that considers symbols. So the last slide, which I'll expand on later, you're talking about the types of information that are symbolic. So, for example, dogs have a much more sophisticated symbolic sense of smell than we do.
And you did touch on the fact that, about emotional filtering as well. So, I mean, we started to touch on that topic, but yeah, we can go over that in more detail. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you, Sanjay, again.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks. All right, good.